Matt Schaff and Jared Smola of DraftSharks.com here to help you set your lineups for Week 14 of the fantasy football season, the last week before the fantasy football playoffs in a lot of leagues. If that's the case for you, you can check DraftSharks.com now for our updated strategy guide for the fantasy football playoffs. Some players at every position who are getting strength of schedule boosts over those final 3 weeks of the fantasy season. Some guys to potentially avoid because their schedules look rough. Don't overplay the matchups, but knowing what's coming can be helpful to like break ties with your lineup decisions, to maybe show you where you might need to add a second quarterback. Jared, anything else that you would add to that?
I would say at this point of the year, our matchup data is as strong as it's ever been, right? We have a bigger sample of this stuff. Now you still have to be careful because these teams trend up and down throughout the season. We're going to talk about someone like the Bears, who have really been a good pass defense for a lot of the season, but they've kind of sagged lately, and that might not be reflected in the numbers. So you always got to be careful. You always got to dig into this stuff a bit deeper than the initial numbers would say. But yeah, I think the matchup numbers now matter as much as they have all season.
Yeah, certainly don't make your decisions just based on matchups. If you've got a really good player in a rough matchup, you might go ahead and play him, but it's worth knowing. And of course, you can check our strength of schedule pages now for Week 14 if you really need a win this week and you need every edge you can get, especially with 6 teams on bye. And that's going to show up in the players we'll talk about, Jared. Let's jump into those players now. And it's Isaac Guerendo week as much as it is anybody else because of the injuries in the San Francisco backfield. Now we have to decide how high we play Isaac Guerendo. So where does he sit for you in the running back rankings? Maybe who are some guys that may or may not be surprising that you would play Guerendo ahead of this week?
I'm pretty excited about his opportunity. This is a truly freaky size speed athlete, 221 pounds and a 4.33 40. So you couple that with this Shanahan running game, which has always been efficient. Guerendo's a different type of runner than Jordan Mason, even Christian McCaffrey. I think he's going to be more boom bust, but those booms are there. We've seen him break some big plays already this season. And then on top of that, the matchup here is about as strong as you could ask for. The Bears talked about their pass defense sagging lately. They've been a bad run defense all season. They are 30th in run defense DVOA. They are 28th in adjusted fantasy points allowed to running backs. They've allowed the 6th most running back rushing yards at 5.0 yards per carry. So it's a really good spot for Guerendo. Of course, the question is we don't know exactly how work's going to be split, how much of the backfield they're going to give to Guerendo, but we do have some hints. We talked about on the waiver show in the last game that Jordan Mason exited early before McCaffrey came back. Guerendo outcarried Patrick Taylor 13-2 after Mason exited. So if we get anything close to that level of split, I think Guerendo's a pretty strong fantasy play this week. He's definitely not a must start, but I think with 6 teams on bye, in most cases, if you were able to grab Guerendo off waivers this week, or if you already had him stashed, I think he's going to be starting for you.
Yeah, not a must start, but a nice start. And, by the end of the weekend, he certainly could look like somebody that you should have started. We always talk about how friendly the offense is to running back scoring and running back production. And I looked back, all the way back through Kyle Shanahan being in San Francisco, just to kind of remind myself how friendly it's been. We know that Christian McCaffrey's been excellent recently. Christian McCaffrey is always excellent. He's a very good player. But before Christian McCaffrey arrived, we had 2021 Elijah Mitchell as a rookie. Year before that, it was Jeff Wilson Jr. emerging to join Raheem Mostert as productive running backs. The year before that was Raheem Mostert coming basically out of nowhere, did nothing over 4 seasons before that, across 5 teams. Matt Breida before that, Alfred Morris in Washington, Devontae Freeman in Atlanta, Steve Slayton in Houston. It goes all the way back. Even Kyle Shanahan's lone season as the OC in Cleveland, he got 16 rushing touchdowns from Isaiah Crowell, Terrence West, and Ben Tate combined. So it's a great spot to be the running back. We don't know for sure what the workload will be, but we should assume that Guerendo is going to lead Patrick Taylor. I don't think that we should assume too much from either running back that joined the team this week. We'll see if they're even active for the game, but we'll know that before the game starts. So yeah, overall, I think Guerendo sits in that RB2 area. Not a must start, but a guy that I would like to try to get into the lineup as long as I'm not, already set at my 2 running back slots or 3 if I'm using a flex spot too.
Yeah, well, one other note on Guerendo, I think he's going to do more in the passing game than Jordan Mason did. Not obviously nearly as much as Christian McCaffrey has done it and had been doing this season, but Guerendo caught some balls in his final season at Louisville. Kyle Shanahan talked up his pass catching ability on Wednesday. And also in that Week 8 game that Mason left early, Guerendo ended up running a route on 62% of the drop dropbacks, which is a really strong number for a running back. So I don't think he's going to be like the near zero that Jordan Mason was in the passing game. I'm not sitting even the like fringy RB1/RB2 types, like James Cook, James Conner, David Montgomery. I'm playing over Guerendo this week. But to me, like when you get into the Rico Dowdle, Najee Harris territory, like, yeah, those guys are safer bets for touches. We know their roles at this point. But I think Guerendo's going to play a similar role. I just like his upside better in this running game we've been talking about. And again, with that big playability that he has.
Yeah, I'm playing Aaron Jones and Najee Harris over Isaac Guerendo because they have been getting their good workloads. Aaron Jones has been productive. Najee Harris has been at 20 plus touches nearly all of his recent games. So I trust that a little bit more, especially in a matchup that's not terrible. But that's also a range where if you're like, I'm starting Guerendo over Najee Harris, I can't really fight you on it because the upside is certainly there. Breece Hall is an interesting guy, but we'll talk about him in a few minutes. I think it's important to look at the rest of the San Francisco offense right now, too, especially because we're coming off a goofy game at Buffalo that's going to kind of skew everybody's view of what's actually going on there. Plus the shoulder injury for Brock Purdy, which may or may not still be a factor. So I guess more broadly, what are you expecting from Brock Purdy and his wide receivers this week? And then maybe beyond that, too.
And if we trust Kyle Shanahan, which we probably shouldn't on injuries at this point. He said on Monday that, Purdy's shoulder is no longer an issue. He's not rehabbing it this week. And Purdy was a full practice participant on Wednesday. So maybe against my better judgment, but I'm considering the shoulder a non-issue. There are still concerns for Purdy this week. I mean, he lost CMC for the season. That doesn't help. We'll have to see about Trent Williams. And, that matters for Guerendo too. Trent Williams, the 49ers stud left tackles, missed the last few games. He's still iffy for this one. And then there is this matchup against the Bears, which we've been talking about. The Bears are third in adjusted fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks on the season. But again, over the last 3 weeks, and those games came against Packers, Vikings, and Lions, good offenses, but they have allowed 9.6 yards per pass attempt, 5 total passing touchdowns across those 3 games. So I don't think this matchup is as tough as it was early in the season. And I think if we consider Purdy's shoulder a non-issue at this point, I do think he's, an okay QB1 play this week again, especially with all these teams on bye.
Yeah, I think we kind of have to assume that the coach is not lying about that because he did put in a full practice Wednesday. We'll watch that participation the next couple of days as well. But as long as there's no signal to the opposite, we should probably take that out of the calculation. Brock Purdy's at the bottom of our top 12, which makes sense. He's behind, some higher upside guys, maybe some safer guys. And then just behind him are the guys like Jameis Winston, Will Levis, that we'll talk about in a few minutes, who could certainly outscore Brock Purdy this week, but also come with landmines. So I think that's a fair spot to have Brock Purdy. He's like a safer level of that type of quarterback. And then it would certainly help if Deebo Samuel could rebound. I don't know that we have any signal that that's going to happen, though. I was a little surprised that we didn't get any Deebo carries in that game against Buffalo. And I'm going to be watching that aspect, especially this week, because with the 2 running back injuries, normally the Niners would pump up Deebo's usage. I mean, he had 8 carries back in week 1, I think it was the first game without Christian McCaffrey this year. We have not seen a whole lot of rushing usage lately. And I think if we don't see at least 4 to 5 Deebo carries in this game, that to me is a signal that there's something wrong with him. Yeah. And that his coach isn't in, we got to get Deebo the ball mode.
Yeah, I'm not sure what's up with Deebo. He's been one of the more disappointing players in fantasy this season. It'll be interesting to kind of dig into him in the offseason as we look ahead to 2025. He has 0 carries now in 2 straight games. He has just 1 carry over his last 3. He hasn't reached 25 receiving yards in any of his last 3 games. And even over the course of the season, he's topped 62 receiving yards just 3 times. He's wide receiver 44 right now in PPR points per game. It's tough to like him as more than a wide receiver 3, even with all the teams on bye this week. Now, Christian McCaffrey's absence leaves behind more opportunity for Deebo both in the passing and running games. We'll see if he gets it because he hasn't been lately, but he's definitely not someone I'm looking to jam into my lineup no matter what. I know a lot of teams are going to have to start him because of the bye weeks, but I'm a little worried about Deebo, this week and for the rest of the season.
Yeah, like I'm not reaching for Nick Westbrook-Akine to start over Deebo this week. It certainly might work out if you do, but that's the level where I'm like, I'm just going to roll with Deebo and see what happens.
Yep, agreed.
We teased Breece Hall a little bit earlier. He came back from the bye, had a terrible week by his standards last week, and watched the other 2 running backs get more involved. So do we trust Breece Hall in our week 14 lineups?
Not to the extent you drafted him as an RB1. I would not consider him an RB1. He could bounce back in terms of workload and production, all that stuff. The playing time was down last week. His 61% snap rate last week was a season low, second lowest route rate of the season, tied a season low with his 13 opportunities. He had just 12 carries and 1 target last week. There's a few things going on here, I think. One is the knee injury that he suffered in the game prior to the bye week, and Hall went DNP on Wednesday last week, limited, and then he was full go on Friday, but still listed as questionable. I do think the knee is a factor here. The other factor is the Jets are 3-9 now. I mean, we're at the point of the season where we have to start thinking about these teams and their motivation levels and what they're trying to do at this point. Like, the Jets season is over. Not that they're, considering Isaiah Davis as, a feature part of the offense long term, but like, it would make sense for them, especially with Hall's knee injury, to just ease off him a little bit. Again, 6 teams on bye. It's going to be tough to sit Breece Hall, but he, even with the teams on bye, he is not inside the top 12. You're probably gonna have to start him, but he's definitely not a comfortable start at this point.
For sure. Like, I think it's at the level where if you say, man, I'm starting Isaac Guerendo over Breece Hall this week, I'm like, I'm not sure I can make that move in my own lineup, but I get it. And I think the knee is really the key. I think we probably didn't pay it enough attention last week. Like you said, no practice Wednesday, but returned to limited Thursday and then a full Friday was questionable. So you always have to guess at what those two things mean together. I think we generally see, full Friday. All right, that guy's fine. Questionable is just, something that they do. He'll be all right to play. But he played a season low snap share, tied a season low with 12 touches. We saw Braylon Allen and Isaiah Davis combine to nearly match Breece Hall in pass routes. I mean, that's especially, I think, an indicator that Breece Hall's knee was not right, because there's no way that Braylon Allen and Isaiah Davis, or either of them on their own, is close to Breece Hall as a receiving option. No practice for Breece Hall this week on Wednesday again. I think we'll see how he goes through the week. If he turns up questionable again, like, I might even be in favor of dropping him down below that RB14 level where he is right now. Because if Isaiah Davis is catching 3 balls after playing 6 total offensive snaps, the season to date before then, there's something wrong.
For sure. And the Dolphins' run defense has been good lately. Just last week, they really limited Josh Jacobs. Jacobs ended up having a nice fantasy game in large part because of a big catch and run he had late in the game. But the Dolphins' run defense has been strong lately, so it's not a good matchup for Breece Hall this week either.
The Chiefs have a tough set of matchups the rest of the way for running back scoring, but I think the bigger factor in deciding whether to play and who to play is looking at the distribution of touches, Jared. So what are you doing with the Chiefs backfield? Let's start with this week, because then I think this week's going to end up instructing what we can do the rest of the way.
Yeah, these are always tricky because, I think we all expected Isaiah Pacheco to be limited in his first game back last week. It was his first game since week 2, coming off a broken leg. So I think by the end of the season, by the time we get to the playoffs, Pacheco's going to be the clear lead back. I don't have much question about that. The question is, how quickly does he get there, right? How quickly do they ramp him up? I mean, this is a big game against the Chargers. The Chiefs can actually clinch the AFC West if they win this game. Pacheco, clearly the Chiefs' best running back. I mean, we even saw that last week, despite being limited, easily outproduced Kareem Hunt on the same number of carries. So I think Pacheco's role grows this week over what we saw last week. Exactly how much it grows, that's the tricky part here. That's why Pacheco sits where he does in our running back rankings. He's higher than he was based on what he did last week, but he's also lower than he would be if we knew he was getting a full workload.
Yeah, I'm wary. It sounds like probably even more wary than you are. We got almost identical playing time from Pacheco and Kareem Hunt last week against the Raiders. First game back, not a surprise. But we also had more pass routes for Kareem Hunt than Pacheco in that game. We also had Samaje Perine mixing in for 18 snaps, nearly all of that in the passing game. And I think although the Chiefs have motivation to win this game and lock things up and get the top seed in the AFC, they also have motivation to not overwork Pacheco ahead of the playoffs. Like we saw last year where Travis Kelce was pretty quiet down the stretch of the regular season before going back to being Travis Kelce in the playoffs. The Chiefs have managed to win without Isaiah Pacheco this whole time. I think they probably think that they can keep doing that. And it's probably more advantageous for them to, make sure that he's healthy for the playoffs than to overwork him here, especially to beat the Chargers, but really just in general down the stretch. So I would be wary of using Isaiah Pacheco this week. And then I'm curious to see if anything changes this week to signal that we can feel better about using him over the final 3 of most fantasy seasons.
Yeah, that's all fair. Pacheco sits higher in our running back rankings than I'd like him to, but again, it's mostly a product of all the teams on bye this week. I'm expecting 10 to 15 touches for Pacheco on Sunday night against the Chargers. This matchup too, I think it's better than it might look if you're just looking at the fantasy points allowed. The Chargers are just 15th in run defense DVOA, and they're allowing 4.6 yards per carry to running backs this season. They're definitely tougher against the pass than the run. Now, the Chiefs have gone back to being one of the pass heaviest offenses in the NFL over the last 4 or 5 weeks of the season after being more balanced than usual early on. So I do think that what you mentioned about the passing game usage for Pacheco is key. He needs to pick up more of that because there's not going to be a ton of carries to go around in this backfield. I do think the Chiefs are going to continue to lean on the passing game, but we've seen Pacheco do plenty in the passing game before, and again, I think that's going to start to ramp up here as well.
And plenty of injuries in the front seven for the Chargers, like plenty of guys that look like they're going to play, but lots of guys even who are active, such as Khalil Mack, dealing with stuff. Speaking of matchups, we got some quarterbacks to figure out this week because those 6 teams are on bye, taking away Lamar Jackson, Jaden Daniels, and some other guys. So, Jared, we're not only considering Brock Purdy, who we already talked about, but I think some key streaming level quarterbacks that people are wondering about, and I've been asked about already: Jameis Winston, Will Levis, Caleb Williams. How are you sorting that trio for Week 14 specifically?
Yeah, I'll start with Jameis Winston, who would be my favorite among that group if I'm looking for a spot starter this week. And listen, I get the matchup is bad. It's as bad as it gets, actually. The Steelers are first in adjusted fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks, but the opportunity for fantasy production for Winston's just so huge that even if he's not efficient, it's kind of tough for him to really fail. Since taking over as the Browns starter 5 games ago, Winston's second in pass attempts per game. He's first in air yards per game. He's third in expected fantasy points per game among quarterbacks, and he's fourth in actual fantasy points per game among quarterbacks. So, I get the matchup's tough against Pittsburgh, although Winston had a pretty nice game against them a couple weeks ago, in the snow. He averaged 8.1 yards per attempt in that game, but I feel good about him getting 40 pass attempts. And if you give a guy 40 pass attempts, it's hard to really bust in fantasy.
Yeah, I agree with that. The volume, the opportunities there, they're probably going to need him to throw the ball in this matchup against Pittsburgh. You know what you're getting into with Winston. And because it's been kind of a sales pitch for using Jameis Winston, let me just mention that he's QB 14 in our rankings right now. So it's not like we have him at 5 and telling people that you should go ahead and play him over the quarterback that you've been starting the past few weeks. This is if you need a quarterback this week, you are chasing the upside with Winston. You have to know that the downside is also there. 5 starts for him so far with the Browns. 3 of those have included 3+ turnover-worthy throws. He has been picked 3 times in 2 of his starts, of course, including that game against Denver, where he also threw touchdowns to every single person on the field, and ended up QB1 despite throwing 3 picks for the week. Should have been picked multiple times in that Baltimore game, which he wasn't. And that last one that Kyle Hamilton dropped boosted the yardage, provided the last touchdown for Winston. So that's one game where he wouldn't have been as good if the defender had just hung on to the interception that was gifted to him. Winston's fantasy finishes by week so far, though: QB7, QB21, QB9, QB18, QB1. So literally capable of anything. He could blow up your week, or he could blow up and make your week. And you just have to know that going in. You have to weigh that versus who else you're considering. I agree. I would go ahead and take a shot on Winston and probably not watch the game over Will Levis, over Caleb Williams if I'm making that call. Any other points on those two?
These guys are all close. It's not like I have Winston well above these other guys, and they're all pretty similar. I think. Levis as well can make your week. He could finish as the top 5 fantasy quarterback this week. He could also, finish outside the top 15 pretty easily. But Levis has played better since coming back from the shoulder injury. He's averaging 240 passing yards per game, 1.8 passing touchdowns per game over his last 4, plus 17 rushing yards. He's been running more since coming back from the shoulder injury, which is nice to see. Really, for Levis, it's the matchup, though. Jacksonville dead last in both pass defense DVOA and adjusted fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks. The Jags have allowed 300 plus passing yards and or multiple passing touchdowns in 8 of their 12 games this season. So it hasn't just been 2 or 3 massive games against Jacksonville boosting the points allowed metric. It's really just all season they've been giving up big production to quarterbacks.
I think one key difference between Will Levis and Jameis Winston, besides those matchups, which obviously favors Levis, we haven't seen the ultimate ceiling from Levis. QB9, 20, 10, and 21 those past 4 weeks. Has been playing better, hasn't been giving us huge points. So the upside to date has been in low QB1 territory. And, we talked about the passing volume for Cleveland. Obviously, it's a good passing matchup, but it's also not a bad rushing matchup. I think we'll see plenty of the Tennessee running backs mixed in here. I don't think the Titans would want to have Will Levis throw, 38 plus times. So I think the ceiling's just higher on Winston. And, both of these guys have the downside risk of turning the ball over.
Yeah, no, the passing volume point is really good. I think, if the Titans would love to have Levis throw the ball, 29 times in this game, which might happen, right? It's going to be Mac Jones under center. If he doesn't push back at all, that could be the biggest risk to Levis's fantasy production this week.
Things have gotten better for Caleb Williams since the OC switch. He had 3 straight really bad passing games before they fired Shane Waldron. Since then, 74% completions against the Packers, 340 yards and 2 touchdowns against the Vikings, and then the late comeback on Thanksgiving to get to 256 yards, 3 touchdowns against the Lions. I'm still not ready to trust Caleb Williams, though. We've seen a lot of bad from him this year and some good. He's at San Francisco this week, at Minnesota after that, against Detroit beyond that. So, the matchups aren't great in his favor. San Francisco could swing either way on defense, but they have gotten a little healthier in the secondary, got Charvarius Ward back from, his terrible personal issue that kept him out for a few games. Diamador Lenore practiced in a limited capacity on Wednesday, so he might be back, the slot cornerback for the Niners. So I'd ultimately just rather watch what happens to Caleb Williams this week instead of betting my lineup on it.
Yeah, I'm gonna do there. I'd play Winston and Levis over Caleb Williams this week because the final box score and the final fantasy production for Williams was awesome last week, but that first half was brutal. Like, it looked like he was going to totally bust after the first half. I still don't feel confident in him in this passing game. Might happen, but yeah, like you said, Matt, the Niners, they're leaky against the run, but they're still 6th in pass defense DVOA. They're 11th in adjusted points allowed to quarterbacks. And I think because they're much worse against the run than the pass, the Niners are 31st in pass rate over expected against. They've been, one of the bigger run funnels this year where teams look to run against them. And we'll see about the Bears backfield. Roschon Johnson and DeAndre Swift both did not practice on Wednesday. So we'll see about that. But I do think if the Bears can have it their way, they would definitely prefer to, play this game on the ground more than through the passing game.
I will say the improvement in the offense overall and the passing production in general makes me a little bit comfier with starting Bears receivers. I think that's a lower level bet because obviously we have to fill multiple slots instead of choosing just one quarterback. So we got DJ Moore in wide receiver 2 territory this week, Keenan Allen wide receiver 3, Rome Odunze inside the top 40. Negative matchup still, like I mentioned, against the 49ers, who, especially if they have all of their cornerbacks back on the field. But I feel okay about this Bears trio the rest of the way. What about you?
Yeah, DJ Moore and Keenan Allen, for sure. DJ Moore and Keenan Allen are both top 10 among wide receivers in expected fantasy points per game and actual fantasy points per game in the last 3 games since Thomas Brown took over. So, they, if anything, they might be too low in our rankings, but we do have them down a bit because of this matchup. Rome Odunze is 28th among wide receivers in expected points per game over the last 3. So, he's kind of 3rd in line for targets, and he's just more of the downfield guy, and Caleb Williams just has not been connecting on those downfield shots very often this season. So that's where it's hurting Odunze. He's definitely the most volatile among these 3. I think the clear number 3 in this wide receiver core at this point, but there is some upside there because again, if he connects on one of those deep shots, and all of a sudden you're looking at a nice fantasy outing.
Some upside, and also worth keeping in mind just in case DJ Moore or Keenan Allen gets hurt. That's bound to mean more opportunities available for Odunze. So maybe a handcuff type of guy that you stash if there's not something more attractive and he's available in your league. We talked about injuries. You mentioned the Bears running backs being on the injury report. Ladd McConkey is also on the injury report this week. Sounds like his participation in this game is going to be in doubt. We'll obviously watch that throughout the week to see what happens. But assuming at the moment that there is no Ladd McConkey in the Chargers lineup this week against the Chiefs, what are we doing here?
It'd obviously be a big loss for the Chargers if McConkey can't play. He did get in a limited practice on Wednesday, so he has a shot. We're going to have to, monitor it throughout the week, and it's a Sunday night game, so it could be a tricky situation for McConkey owners. Ladd leads the Chargers in targets, catches, and receiving yards this season. He's accounted for 24% of the team's targets, 27% of the catches, 34% of the receiving yards. So for starters, I think McConkey's absence would be bad news for Justin Herbert. It would, bump him down a few spots in the rankings. As far as the wide receivers go, I would guess Josh Palmer would be the one to move into McConkey's slot role. Palmer has played the 2nd most slot snaps among Chargers receivers this season. And that's really where you want to attack the Chiefs pass defense. Their slot corner, Shamari Connor, has really struggled this season. The Chiefs on the year are 30th in adjusted points allowed to slot receivers. So, I mean, again, we don't know for sure how the Chargers would play it, but I do think Palmer would be the one, to me, that would get the biggest boost. I still think Quentin Johnson might be the better fantasy bet, but I think it'd be close at that point. And I think Palmer would be an option as a wide receiver 4 flex play for teams that are, dealing with bye week issues.
And one key thing to keep in mind there is that we're really guessing because we haven't seen the Chargers this year without Lad McConkey. He's topped 60% playing time in every game but week 2. So he's been on the field. Maybe there's more Josh Palmer in the slot. There also might be more Jalen Reagor in the slot. He has been mixing in that area and has played more than Darius Davis since joining the team. I think the guy that might get the biggest relative boost for me fantasy wise might be Will Dissly, because his slot usage has increased over the past 5 games. Over the first 7 weeks, he reached 20% slot rates in just 2 of those games. He's been over 30% each of the past 5 weeks, including 2 games over 40%. And again, that's with Lad McConkey in the lineup, so it's not like they were missing their primary slot guy. Will Dissly disappointed us last week, but I think even if McConkey plays this week, Dissly makes for an okay start. And if McConkey doesn't play, then Dissly gains some upside. Certainly not safe, but is also heading into a matchup that's been positive for tight end scoring.
Yeah, for sure. I think Dissly bounces back this week. I think, despite the goose egg last week, if you've been kind of relying on him as your fantasy starter, I'd feel okay going back to him this week. As you said, Matt, the Chiefs are 27th in adjusted fantasy points allowed to tight ends. Kind of over the middle of the field is where you attack that pass defense.
If you drafted Marvin Harrison Jr., you have not been counting on him for most of the season. If you have, then he's been letting you down. But before last week's game, Jonathan Gannon, the head coach, said, we'll get him going today. The passing game will go through him. And then we got a season high 12 targets for Marvin Harrison Jr., tied Trey McBride for the team lead in that game. Of course, he caught only 5 of them for 60 yards, did score a touchdown, but that's how it's been going. 52.6% catch rate for Marvin Harrison on the season. He's behind Michael Wilson and Greg Dortch, teammates in that category, also behind Michael Wilson in receiving success rate. Jared, I think if the targets stay up, and we can't expect 12 per game, but if the targets stay up, if they really are trying to get him the ball more, then he could have a strong fantasy playoffs. They've got a nice set of matchups. Now, I say if because before Sunday, we got 8 straight games of 7 targets or fewer. And during that stretch, Harrison was averaging 5.5 targets per game, 3.3 catches per game. That included just 3 receptions in the first game against Seattle, which they have a rematch with this week. So I think there's upside to Marvin Harrison Jr. If I have him, I'm cautiously optimistic, but I'm certainly not counting on Sunday marking a turnaround.
I don't expect the targets to remain, up at that level the rest of the season. And really, target share hasn't been a big issue for Marvin Harrison Jr. this season. He's at a 22% target share. That's fine. It's probably about how we had him projected back in the summer. The big issue is that the Cardinals remain a run-heavy offense. So a 22% target share and a run-heavy offense doesn't mean as much. And then the targets Harrison gets, he doesn't get any easy targets. They're almost all downfield shots. He seems like he's always tightly covered, and these are contested targets. He has a 14% average target depth this season. That's 15th highest among 112 qualifying wide receivers. So that's just going to add to the volatility. Because he's had some big games this season, right? He's had some games with a couple touchdowns. He's had some nice yardage games, but if he doesn't connect on those deep shots, it's going to be a dud for fantasy. And really at this point, I just think Trey McBride is just a better passing game option than Harrison at this point of their career. So Seahawks rematch this week. In their first meeting a couple weeks ago, we saw Trey McBride out target Marvin Harrison 15-6. I wouldn't bet on that type of disparity in this one, but I would bet on, Trey McBride being the leader of this passing game in this matchup.
I wouldn't chase too hard after playing Harrison this week, but he's playable in wide receiver 3 range. If we do get a good game from him, then there is a nice set of matchups: Patriots, Panthers, Rams after that. So like I said, if the targets stay up, then we could get some meaningful production, but there hasn't been enough for us to say, oh, Marvin Harrison Jr. is about to win you championship.
Agreed.
Let's close it out with tight end, which, we've talked about streaming quarterbacks, but there are probably plenty of people that are in trouble at tight end this week. I've got Will Dissly down. We already talked about him, so just a quick hit on him. Like I said, the role didn't change in that 0 that he gave us against Atlanta this past week. Only Lad McConkey and Quentin Johnston ran more routes than Will Dissly did in that game. The Chiefs, we talked about their weakness at cornerback, and it's both inside and the outside spot opposite Trent McDuffie. They are still a slightly negative scoring matchup for wide receivers on the season, unless you're Jacoby Myers. They are the 6th most friendly to tight end scoring, though, and much tougher on the run than versus the pass. So we could see the Chargers need to throw the ball. And if they need to do that, then going for a shorter range target like Will Dissly is going to be attractive.
And Dissly's still available in 60% of sleeper leagues, which surprised me. That's why I have him on my list here too as an option. Like if he's available in your league and need a spot setter, he's definitely your best bet. If we want to dumpster dive for tight ends this week, I got 2 for you. The first is Juwan Johnson of the Saints. Last week's season high 7 targets, matched a season high with 5 catches. Also season high 79% route rate. So I don't know if something about the matchup made his usage spike, or if this is kind of what the Saints want to do the rest of the season. But the key here is Taysom Hill is out now. And Taysom Hill not only had been playing a big role in the running game, but he had averaged 5.6 targets per game over the last 5. So there is opportunity available here, especially for the Saints tight end. So I think Juwan Johnson, I'm not going to call him a good option, but he's there if you need him. And then the other one is Grant Calcaterra with Dallas Goedert out for at least this week, if not longer. We've seen 3 games this season without Dallas Goedert. In those games, Calcaterra's route rates 83, 86, and 91%. It's a really strong route participation. 9 targets in those 3 games, 15% target share. That seems fair as a projection at this point. Now, you're obviously not going to get much passing volume from the Eagles in this spot against Carolina, so you're probably talking 3-4 targets for Calcaterra, but it's a good matchup. The Panthers 30th in adjusted points allowed to tight ends, and the Eagles have the high implied total, the highest of the week, so there is some touchdown upside to Calcaterra this week.
Yeah, what's the over-under on Eagles pass attempts this week? Like 11.5?
I was going to say like 24, but yeah, you might be closer.
I'll take the under on 24, honestly. But yeah, we'll see. They'll be able to do pretty much whatever they want to, at least. Both of those guys are like break glass in case of emergency, and then you could steal a touchdown with Calcaterra. And, certainly we've seen Juwan Johnson produce in the past, so it's at least not total guessing on him being able to help us. So, consider them if you're in need at tight end, and be sure to check the rankings for updates as we continue reading all of these injury situations that we've talked about here, plus more. Obviously, there are plenty more throughout the league. As always, your team intel page will give you the best start sit recommendations. It's synced with your league. It knows your scoring system. It knows your lineup settings. It's considering all of the factors that you're asking us about if you are asking how to set your lineup. And if you check the website instead of asking me, then you're taking a little bit of human bias out of it. I try to be objective, but it's impossible to be totally objective when we talk about these guys. Team intel, free agent finder, everything else we do is geared toward making Draft Sharks your unfair advantage.